the Germans had this ideology of Germanizing Eastern Europe. They believed that Eastern Europe was originally inhabited by Germans, and so therefore Eastern Europe was territory that rightfully belonged to the Germans. And so they wanted to exterminate most of the native Slavic populations, replace them with Germans, and then use the remaining Slavs to be the slaves of the Germans who would settle into Eastern Europe. And it all stemmed from this concept of Lebensraum, which means living space. And so they believed that by purging Eastern Europe of its native population, they would create living space, or Lebensraum, for the German race. Heinrich Himmler wanted to come up with a plan by which to exterminate the Slavs and replace them with Germans. And so he turned to this agricultural expert by the name of Konrad Meyer. He was not only an agricultural expert, but he was also an SS leader. Konrad Meyer came up with this idea known as General Plan Ost. Ost is the German way of saying east, and it basically means the general plan for Eastern Europe. And the plan was to starve the Slavic population to death and then create space for the German race. And it was from this plan where you have the foundation for the German agenda of implementing systematic extermination of the Slavic peoples. And this is why you read about all these massacres that took place in Eastern Europe, massacres of entire villages, mass rapes, and also the implementation of starvation as an actual policy by which to purge Eastern Europe of its native Slavic population. Konrad Meyer wanted to utilize starvation as a way to exterminate the Slavs, and the Nazis did utilize starvation. And an example of this is the siege of Leningrad. The siege of Leningrad is an absolute horror story. The Nazis completely cut the city off from any food, and they besieged the city for 900 days. And in those 900 days, 1.5 million Russians died, and out of that number, 600,000 Russians died from starvation. And this was an example of the General Plan Ost being implemented. And the Nazis, they believed that this was all rightfully done. They believed that this was all righteous action because in their demonic and diabolical ideology, the Slavs were an inferior race. They needed to be purged out of the human gene pool so that the Germans can take massive amounts of territory, expand their presence, and pass down their genes so that the human gene pool could have this influx of superior German genes. And the Slavic genetics were inferior, and so they were thereby corrupting and diminishing the human gene pool. Now, what is the foundation for all of this evil? The foundation for this evil is social Darwinism, which goes back to Charles Darwin, who was an Englishman. He wasn't even German. And the Darwinistic ideology that came from Charles Darwin taught that humanity was diminishing because inferior genes were allowed to be passed on. They were allowed to be passed on because society takes care of the weak. Society takes care of the quote-unquote inferior people, and so those inferior genes are allowed to be perpetuated, and so therefore they are allowed to diminish and to ruin the human gene pool. In order for mankind to evolve into his next step of evolution, in order for mankind to evolve into something that is better than him, well, the inferior genes have to be gotten rid of because they are holding back the process of evolution. They are hindering the process of evolution towards the Übermensch, towards the Superman, towards a creature that is superior to what humanity is right now. Charles Darwin believed that one of the tragedies of modern society was the procreation of people of inferior stock. And this is what he believed. He actually lamented that people of superior genes were having less children than those who had what he considered to be inferior genetics. And so this was diminishing the process of evolution according to Charles Darwin. Well, the Nazis had the same way of thinking. They believed that that people of inferior stock were ruining the gene pool, and this is why they exterminated people who had mental and physical defects. This is why they murdered people because they had Down syndrome. This is why they exterminated Slavic people. This is why they wanted to annihilate the Slavic race and clear Eastern Europe of its native Slavic population so that Germans could expand and settle in Eastern Europe, because they believed in their Darwinistic ideology that the Germans were of superior genetic stock, the Slavs were of inferior genetic stock, so therefore Slavic genes was bad for the gene pool. And so the Nazis believed that they were aiding in the process of evolution. Well, let's go back to the policy of systematic starvation. Charles Darwin did not get his ideas out of nowhere. Charles Darwin was influenced by his grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, but Charles Darwin was also directly influenced by a guy named Thomas Malthus. Now, back in the late 1700s, early 1800s, Malthus, who was, believe it or not, an Anglican minister, began to teach this ideology of population control. And he believed that those of inferior stock should be allowed to just die, that society should not take care of the weak and the infirm. And he believed that the government should implement policies that would facilitate the mass deaths of certain people. And Malthus believed that the state should do this by making roads in certain areas more narrow so that disease could spread faster. Malthus also believed that the poor should be encouraged to be dirty and filthy so that they could become easily sick. And Malthus also believed that the state should not clean the water in certain areas, should allow the water supply in certain areas to be filthy so that people could be infected with waterborne diseases and die. So he believed that the state should neglect certain people so that they can die, that the state should facilitate the mass deaths of certain people. And Malthus believed that if we didn't do this, that we would have overpopulation, and overpopulation would eventually lead to resources being completely dry and would ultimately lead to mass starvation. Well, Darwin read Malthus's essay on population, and he said, wait a second, we're taking care of all of these inferior people, and the weak are allowed to procreate, the inferior are allowed to procreate, and they're allowed to pass down their inferior genetics. And because we're allowing this perpetuation of inferior genes, then the stock of mankind is diminishing as the generations manifest, as newer generations are born. Mankind is continuously degenerating because of society's care for people of inferior stock, and so we are, according to Darwin, facilitating the diminishment of the human gene pool. So Darwin takes Malthus and he builds on it, and he comes up with this theory of evolution that, well, in order for mankind to evolve into something better, inferior genes need to be gotten rid of, need to be purged out. But going back to Malthus believed that if we didn't get rid of certain people, we would have too many people, and we would have overpopulation, and then we would have starvation because there wouldn't be enough food to feed everyone. Well, when the Irish potato famine happened, the English simply said, well, the reason why the Irish are starving is because of overpopulation, and so we should just allow those Irish people to starve to death, so that we could have less people, and therefore we can have more resources because we won't have to feed so many people. And so the Irish potato famine was, to a great extent, a result of the implementation of Malthusian ideology. Well, fast forward to the 1940s, here are the Germans talking about utilizing starvation to get rid of certain people. Going back to the British believed that the Irish were inferior. So when the Irish were starving, they didn't give a damn. They said, well, those Irish people are inferior anyway, and so let them starve to death because, according to Malthus, the inferior should be allowed to die so that we can have more resources for those of better stock, and we don't have to feed all of these inferiors. And the Germans, they essentially said the same thing about the Slavs. The Slavs are producing all of this wheat. Germans are having difficulty with food shortages, so let's just invade Eastern Europe, take their wheat, take all their resources, and because the Slavs are inferior, we should just allow them to starve to death. We should actually starve them to death. And the Germans actually calculated which areas of Russia, which areas of the Soviet Union were the most fecund for producing wheat, producing food. And so they said, okay, northern Russia is too cold, and the soil there is not very good, but southern Russia and Ukraine are filled with very, very fecund soil. And so those are the areas that are going to produce all the food. And we should just take over Eastern Europe, take their food, take their resources. And they concluded, well, let's just starve the North of food, take away their food, cut them off from any sort of supplies, and starve them. And that's pretty much what happened in Leningrad. The Germans cut Leningrad off from any food, and hundreds of thousands of people starved to death. And this was a part of the General Plan Ost, which was developed by Konrad Meyer. But the ideology of Meyer, the ideology of the Nazis, had as its foundation social Darwinism and eugenics. And who came up with Darwinism? Charles Darwin. Who came up with eugenics? The nephew of Darwin, Francis Galton. So the fact that the nephew of Darwin developed the idea of eugenics, and his idea of eugenics was built upon the foundation that his uncle laid out, really goes to show that eugenics and Darwinism go hand in hand. And the fact that it was the nephew of Darwin who came up with the idea tells us that it was really just a generation away from what Darwin taught. That eugenics was just a generation away from what Darwin taught. It didn't take very long. And just fast forward to the 1930s and the 1940s, and you will see what Darwinism led to. And the fact that Darwinism is still a mainstream idea today tells us that Nazism has the potential of being revived. As long as there is Darwinism, as long as you have evolutionism being held as a mainstream idea today, tells us that Nazism can be revived because evolutionism and Darwinism are held as mainstream ideas. And going all the way back to Darwin was directly influenced by Thomas Malthus. Malthus came up with the idea of population control. And so when the Irish were starving, the British let them starve to death. Didn't give a damn. In fact, the English made it worse by taking away more potatoes from the Irish. Okay, whatever harvest you guys produced, it's going to come to us. Well, this policy stemmed back to Malthus. Darwin's ideology went back to Malthus. And then you see the Nazis implementing a policy of starvation, and their ideology went back to Darwin. And ultimately, it went back to Malthus. So you have all of these moments in history, be it the Irish potato famine, be it what the Nazis did, where Darwinism was being implemented. And you have other examples. You have the eugenics policy that was being implemented in the United States. You have the eugenics policy that was being implemented in Japan and Sweden. You have all of these instances where eugenics was being imposed. And it all goes back to Darwin. And Darwin is held as this scientific hero. And his theory is held as this as this theory that if you don't accept, then you're considered to be a complete moron and you're laughed upon. And it's like, well, you don't have to believe in evolutionism to be a doctor. You don't have to be an evolutionist. You don't have to believe in evolutionism to be a brain surgeon. You don't have to. You don't have to believe in evolution to be a pediatrician. But if you don't believe in evolutionism, you're considered a complete and utter moron. It's an elitist ideology that is not required to be believed in to be a doctor or an engineer or a surgeon, a brain surgeon. It's just an elitist ideology. And as long as it is held as this mainstream idea, the prospect of Nazism being revived is here. It's in our midst. Anyway, you guys just heard some theology. God bless.